Hey, so I thought I'd read you a story today. This one is by Jules Verne. It's called Journey to the Center of the Earth. So I hope you like sci-fi novels. Let's see. Alright, let's get started. On the 24th of May, 1863, which was a Sunday, my uncle, Professor Leidenbrock, came rushing back towards his little house. Number 19, Königstrasse, one of the oldest streets in the old quarter of Hamburg. Martha must have thought she was very behindhand, for the dinner was only just beginning to sizzle on the kitchen stove. Well, I said to myself, if my uncle is hungry, he'll make a dreadful fuss, for he's the most impatient of men. Professor Leidenbrock here already, cried poor Martha in astonishment, half opening the dining room door. Yes, Martha, but don't worry if the dinner isn't cooked, because it isn't 2 o'clock yet. St. Michael's clock has only just struck 1:30. Then why is Professor Leidenbrock coming home? He'll probably tell us himself. Here he is. I'm off, Mr. Axel. You'll get him to see reason, won't you? And our good Martha went back to her culinary laboratory. I was left alone, but as for getting the most irascible of professors to see reason, that was a task beyond a man of my rather undecided character. So I was getting ready to beat a prudent retreat to my little room upstairs, when the street door creaked on its hinges. Heavy footsteps shook the wooden staircase, and the master of the house, passing through the dining room, rushed straight into his study. But on his way he had found time to fling his stick with the nutcracker head into a corner, his broad-brimmed hat onto the table, and these emphatic words at his nephew, "Axel, follow me." Before I had time to move, the professor called to me again in an impatient voice. "Well, haven't you got here yet?" I rushed into my formidable master's study. Otto Leidenbrock was not, I must admit, a bad man, but unless he changes in the most unlikely way, he will end up as a terrible eccentric. He was a professor at the Johanneum and gave a course of lectures on mineralogy, during every one of which he lost his temper once or twice. Not that he cared whether his pupils attended regularly, listened attentively, or were successful later. These little masters interested him only very slightly. His teaching was what the German philosophers would call subjective. That is to say, it was intended for himself and not for others. He was a selfish scholar, a well of science whose pulley creaked when you tried to draw anything out of it. In short, he was a miser. There are quite a few professors like that in Germany. Unfortunately for him, my uncle had difficulty in speaking fluently. Not so much at home as in public, and this This is a regrettable defect in an orator. Indeed, in his lectures at the Aeneum, the professor would often stop short, struggling with a recalcitrant word which refused to slip between his lips. One of those words which resist, swell up, and finally come out in the rather unscientific form of a swear word. This was what always sent him into a rage. Now in mineralogy there are a great many barbarous terms, half Greek and half Latin, which are difficult to pronounce, and which would take the skin off any poet's lips. I don't want to say a word against that science, far from it. But when one finds oneself in the presence of rhombohedral crystals, retinosphalic resins, galenites, fungicides, molybdenites, tungstates of manganese, and titanite of zirconium, the nimblest tongue may be forgiven for slipping. This pardonable infirmity of my uncle's was well known in the town, and unfair advantage was taken of it. The students waited for the dangerous passages when he lost his temper, and then burst out laughing, which is not in good taste, even in Germany. And if there was always a large audience at the Leidenbrock lectures, a great many of those present undoubtedly came from the chief object of amusing themselves at the spectacle of the professor's rages. However that may be, my uncle, as I have said before and cannot repeat too often, was a true scholar. Although he sometimes broke his specimens by handling them too roughly, he combined the genius of the geologist with the eye of the mineralogist. With his hammer, his steel pointer, his magnetic needle, his blowpipe, and his bottle of nitric acid, he was a force to be reckoned with. From the fracture, appearance, hardness, fusibility, sound, smell, and taste of any given mineral, he could unhesitatingly class it in its proper place among the 600 species known to modern science. The name of Leidenbrock was accordingly mentioned in tones of respect in all colleges and learned societies. Humphrey Davy, Humboldt, Captain Franklin, and General Sabine never failed to call on him when passing through Hamburg, and Becquerel, Eppelman, Brewster, Dumas, Milne Edwards, and St. Clair de Ville frequently consulted him about the most difficult problems in chemistry. The science was indebted to him for some remarkable discoveries, and in 1853 a treatise on transcendental crystallography by Professor Otto Leidenbrock had appeared at Leipzig, an imposing folio volume with plates, which, however, failed to cover its expenses. Over and above all this, I should add that my uncle was the curator of the Mineralogical Museum, founded by Mr. Struve, the Russian ambassador, a valuable collection known all over Europe, This, then, was the gentleman who was calling me so impatiently. Picture to yourself a tall, thin man in excellent health, and with a fair, youthful complexion, which took off a good 10 of his 50 years. His big eyes were constantly rolling behind huge spectacles, and his long, thin nose looked like the blade of a knife. Mischievous students, indeed, asserted that it was magnetized and attracted iron filings. This was sure calumny. It attracted nothing but snuff, though that in great abundance. When I have added that my uncle took mathematical strides 3 feet long, and that as he walked along he kept his fists tightly clenched, a sure sign of an impetuous temperament, you will know him well enough not to hanker after his company. He lived in his own little house in the Königstrasse, a building which was half brick and half wool, half wood, with an indented gable. It overlooked one of those winding canals which intersect in the middle of the oldest quarter of Hamburg, which the great fire of 1842 mercifully spared. It is true that the old house was not exactly perpendicular, and bulged out a little towards the street. Its roof was slightly askew, like the cap over the ear of a Tugendbund student, and the balance of its lines left something to be desired. But all considering, it stood firm, thanks to an old elm which was solidly embedded in the facade, and which in spring used to push its young sprays across the window panes. My uncle was fairly well off for a German professor. The house belonged to him, both the building and its contents, the latter including his goddaughter Grauben, a 17-year-old native of the Verland, our good Martha, and myself. In my dual capacity of nephew and orphan, I became his laboratory assistant. I must admit that I took to geology enthusiastically. I had the blood of a mineralogist in my veins, and I never felt bored in the company of my precious pebbles. All in all, life was happy enough in that little house in the Königstrasse, in spite of the master's fits of temper, for although he was rather brusque with me, he was fond of me all the same. The man was incapable of waiting, and was always in a greater hurry than nature. In April, after he had planted seedlings of mignonette or convolvulus in the earthenware pots in his drawing room, he would go regularly every morning and pull them by the leaves to make them grow faster. With such an eccentric character, obedience was the only course to adopt. I therefore rushed into his study. There we have the end of chapter 1. That set a nice scene, didn't it? Also, that first chapter was called My Uncle Leidenbrock.
The next chapter is called The Strange Parchment. I wonder what it could be. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing more about it. We'll have to save it till next time.